So, hi everyone. I'm really excited today to interview Mr. Dan Hart, FAIA. This interview, we are focusing to know his personal experiences as well as tips and advice to architecture students to face this situation. And also, we'll cover a few questions on how to respond to COVID-19. Mr. Dan, can you tell us about your background?
Yeah, Mayor, thank you for having me today. I'm honored to be interviewed. My start in life was an interesting one. My father was a pastor in the Presbyterian Church and a missionary in Beirut, Lebanon. And so he accepted the position that he held for 20 years in a small rural farming community in North Texas. We had moved there from Beirut as a result of the evacuation by the American Embassy in 1976. And so we went from civil war in Beirut to the pastoral life in a small rural farming community very quickly. It was when I was 8 years old. So the arrangement with that church was that he would take the position as pastor of that church on the condition that it was temporary, because he wanted to go back to Beirut as soon as the fighting died down over there and we were safe to be there as Americans. And we never were able to return. I think that was one of his greatest heartbreaks in his life. But he was an interesting man. He was, in addition to being a pastor, he was also a physicist. And so he seamlessly navigated the domains of faith and reason. And I think that had a deep impression on me. When I look back over my career, indeed, I have done mostly religious architecture and higher education architecture. And so education and religion have played a big role in terms of the tensions that I've held in my career. When I was a junior in high school in this Seymour, Texas, a small community, my geometry teacher, Wayne Akins, introduced us to Euclidean geometry. And so, of course, that's the intuitive axioms built one upon another to create theorems, and then you illustrate those theorems with elegantly derived drawings. And so the logical nature of that, the lyrical nature of that really captivated me. The drawing and the reason and the right brain, left brain. And in that textbook, in my junior year, there was a sidebar at the end of every chapter that said, if you enjoyed the principles in this chapter, you might like being in different occupations every chapter. Well, one chapter said you might enjoy being an architect. And something just sparked in me. And I went right to our small library, went through the card catalogs at that time. It was all analog at that time. And we had one book in our library on architecture, and it was a biography of Frank Lloyd Wright. And so I read that book over and over and checked it out over and over. And apparently I was the only one that ever did, because 15 years later, the librarian of that school library mandated by Texas law, if books don't circulate in the library, they have to do away with those books and get new books that students will read. And so it didn't circulate when I left high school. And so the librarian gave that book to my parents, and I still have it in my library. It's one of the books on the shelf. And so despite never having met an architect, I went to Texas Tech University, embarked on dual degrees in architecture and civil engineering like you did, similar to what you have done. And I think that educational foundation was an ideal grounding in building science coupled with the poetics of form and space. I just think there's something about my educational experience that really prepared me not only for this profession, but for life. And so when I was in college, I had a spring break, went on spring break in Chicago, which was my first time to really experience great buildings. Mies, Wright, Sullivan. Got to actually be there, see them, touch them, smell them. It was just a profound experience for me. And I had decided I wanted to start my career in Chicago. I thought that was the place to be. As it turned out, I met my future wife that same semester in school, and she had another year to graduate. And so I decided I would stick around and wait for her to graduate. Found a job in that town, in Lubbock, where Texas Tech is. And actually the job that most suited me was an engineering position. So I started as a structural engineer, worked under Mike Cartwright, a brilliant engineer, patient guide. He was very patient with me. And I started my career at Parkhill, Smith & Cooper, which is where I am today. So life in West Texas, the western part of the state, which is much more sparsely populated than the eastern part of the state, what really agreed with us. My wife graduated from college, went on to pursue her master's degree. My son was born there. I got registered as an engineer, and I immediately moved from engineering to become an intern architect in the same firm. So I started my architectural career at that point. I mentored under many people, most significantly Mike Moss was a mentor there. And so Texas Tech was, the College of Architecture at Texas Tech is something that's never left me. I've been so appreciative for that experience, that educational experience. Lectured there and been a guest critic there, and was actually an adjunct instructor for a while when I lived in Lubbock. And now I'm founding president of the New Design Leadership Alliance, which is a consortium of practitioners and academicians talking about the gap between academia and practice. And so I guess that's the sort of educational story that brings me up through the education.
I read about your hobbies and interest in reading, distance running, and traveling. One book you would recommend to an architect to read and a place to travel?
I was really, really struck since high school with distance running. What I discovered in high school is that distance runners were 90% will and determination and 10% talent, which suited me. That was perfect for me because I didn't have a lot of talent, but I had a lot of determination and will. And I have found I've run my whole life, and just the contemplative experience of being out and moving your body. That's when I have my best ideas. That's when I sort of can sort through what's going on in life. So running's been a long time hobby. There's a Saint Augustine said about walking. He said in Latin, "Solvitur ambulando." The thing he liked to say, it is solved by walking. And I find that it is solved by running. There's something about that mindless moving your body that really, I think, gets to something in your brain. In terms of books, there's so many, but a couple that come to mind. There's a really small, elegant, beautiful little book called The War of Art by Stephen Pressfield. So Stephen Pressfield is a novelist. And the title is a play on Lao Tzu's The Art of War. But what Pressfield is talking about is the creative process, the war of art. And he introduces this concept of resistance, which he points to as really the main thing to overcome to manifest creativity is this thing he calls resistance. It's just a matter of, he talks about getting up to write every morning on a schedule. Somerset Maugham said one time, "I only write when I'm inspired. Fortunately, inspiration comes to me at 9 o'clock every morning when I sit down to write." And so it's about being disciplined and having some rigor to your schedule that helps you to get past this thing Pressfield calls resistance. So that's one book. There's a much more practical a book that's also been highly influential to me called Getting Things Done by David Allen, which is a personal leadership, time management kind of book. And I think it's a very practical book about how to actually accomplish things in life, but it's deceptively practical. I think it's really deeply profound. One of the things about that book, one of the basic themes of that book is your mind is an amazing tool for having ideas, but it's a terrible storage device for ideas. It's not a very good place to keep ideas. And in fact, the more you try to hold on to ideas in your head, the less able you are to be creative and have ideas. And so it's all about creating an external storage device, which is some kind of system where you store ideas in a way that you can retrieve them through files. And you can do this digitally or on paper. But his basic thesis is getting everything off your mind gives you a sense of peace and frees you to do your best work. And it's ironic, the title says Getting Things Done, but really what it's about is feeling comfortable about the things you're not doing at any moment. And so it's that peace of mind that you get from having a trusted system that allows you to do your best work. So that's been really highly influential book to me.
What is one place you would recommend an architect to travel?
There have been a number of places that I have found to be moving places. I was in France with my family a couple of summers ago, and we were in Lyon, and I realized how close we were to La Tourette, Le Corbusier's La Tourette. So we were there on a river cruise, so I didn't have access to a car. So I just, I Ubered to La Tourette. It was about a 40-minute drive. But it's still one of the best experience I've had. And I think the experiences like that where you just seek out where you're going anyway and see what's around you and go and discover places that maybe you hadn't planned to, those can be really profound and pleasant surprises. But I would say too, there's a really, really beautiful book by Alain de Botton called The Art of Travel. And in that book, he talks about a French philosopher who spent a year in his room. He went on vacation in his room, in one room in his house, and lived in that room. So this is something we can relate to these days as well. But the idea was he discovered his room like he never would have. You know, that there were corners and nooks and crannies in the room that he otherwise moves to. If he hadn't spent all that time looking at just what's around him, he would have never discovered in quite that way. And of course, everything is changing all the time as well. So you're experiencing things in new light and new air, new, things are new all the time, even the same places. And of course, I think there probably are some obsessive qualities about a person that would spend the whole year in their room like that. So it's not that I'm advocating for that, but it really, I think the point is it gives you an appreciation for wherever you are. So I would say approach, especially in the times where we live in right now where we can't travel, appreciate what's around you in a new way. Pretend like you're a tourist to where you live, and go to it with the same excitement and wonder you would if you were going to some new place you've never been. And you can experience it that way. You can really appreciate what's there in ways that you wouldn't think would be possible.
Mm-hmm.
But travel is just key. I think travel is key for architects. You got to go places. You got to go feel them and touch them and be there. You can do a lot of good studying and reading and looking at pictures, but there's no replacement for being there.
Would you like to share any mentors, guide, or role model who made a significant impact in your life?
Yeah, I've mentioned a couple already. Mike Cartwright, who was the structural engineer that hired me, just a brilliant engineer, and his ability he's a highly logical person, highly competent on the scientific side. But what's interesting about Mike, he's retired now, but what's interesting about him is how well informed his intuition was. So he's highly empirical. He could do the calculations and he understood how to do all of the required mathematical manipulation as a structural engineer. But he could also look at a concrete beam and know what reinforcing needed to be in it. I mean, he just was so tuned into that that he had an acute sense of intuition. So he was that's where I started my career as a structural engineer. And it was such a great foundation. I mean, pardon the pun, but it was foundational to my career in addition to being foundational, learning how to design foundations. And then as I started my architectural career, I sat next to Mike Moss, who's now a partner of mine. We're partners together. And he's just one of the best architects. He knows the ins and outs of what it takes to make a building real in the world, and just learned so much from him. And there have been many others. My best friend from college is now president of our firm, so we're partners together. Jay Edwards, just another brilliant engineer. And I've had many colleagues through AIA as well that I consider mentors, people that are friends and who I've learned so much from, like Heather McKinney and Larry Speck and Craig Reynolds and lots of folks.
Now we will move to our another section where we'll discuss about the impact of COVID-19. So, what do you think will be the impact of COVID-19 on the future of architecture profession?
Yeah, well, that's. I think there are going to be some lasting, permanent effects, not just on architecture, but including architecture. I think just on society and on it's so interesting to have an event that is so far-reaching in its impact, and it's happening to everybody around the world at the same time. I think that's unprecedented. I don't. Maybe the other pandemics in history compare, but I think maybe not quite like this one because we're so connected through technology. We're sort of experiencing it, I think, in a way together. I happen to believe that as difficult as this crisis is, and it is a difficult thing for so many people. It's impacting people around the world in so profound, many sad and deeply disturbing ways. But as bad as that is, as extreme as that is, I think we also are living in a bigger crisis. And this crisis, I have a feeling, is going to help us understand the bigger crisis. The bigger crisis is climate change. And so that crisis is more slow moving. It's happening over a longer period of time, maybe harder to see the effects of it. It's certainly not killing tens of thousands of people, in a short period of time. But it is a crisis nonetheless. And I think it's similar to the COVID crisis in that early and decisive action can have really meaningful effects down the road. So if we act now, we can save a lot of grief and sorrow later. And if we had acted earlier in this country on the COVID crisis, I think we would have seen much less destruction than we've seen. And there's a number of parallels. If we're listening to our scientists, the extent to which we're listening to our scientists, all the rest. And then I think on top of, you've got the COVID crisis, you've got this bigger looming crisis of climate, and then you've got these lesser crises that we're going to start to see into the fall of tornadoes and hurricanes, these weather events that are happening. And so some communities are going to feel the effects of 3 different crises at the same time. And I think in terms of architecture, we're going to feel all of that as well. And we're going to have to respond to how do we mitigate and adapt design to be able to withstand these kind of disasters? How do we shape our buildings so that we're healthier and maybe more protected from these crises? Things like infection control, physical separation. Remote work is going to be have a huge impact on our profession. It's incredible to me. My firm is 380 people. We didn't expect to have to move everybody home, but we did in less than a week. And I can't believe, I was just telling one of my partners this morning, if we had decided 6 months ago we wanted to move everybody to their home to work, we would have worked for 6 months with 3 different task forces to figure all that out. Well, it happened, and we moved in less than a week, and it seems like it's working just fine. I mean, I'm amazed at how flexible we can be, but we didn't know we could be that flexible. But I think what we're learning now about how to communicate like we're doing now, how to interact and be collaborative, how to do design from afar, I think that's all going to have really meaningful impacts on how we go forward in this profession in architecture.
Nice. And how it affected the productivity in terms of remote working?
Yeah. Right now, we're so new into it, it's hard to say definitively, but what it looks like from what I can tell is that our productivity is not diminished really at all. We're able to do, there are some things that are harder and there are some things that are easier remotely. So the actual production work, documentation type work, that I think is much more productive when we're working remotely. The interaction with clients to get decisions and to lead through the design process, that's more difficult. It's also more difficult to train a younger professional than it is to interact and collaborate with a seasoned peer. You can, some things are easier, some things are harder. So I think there are some trade-offs, but it looks to me like at this point, we're not suffering any productivity loss.
Okay.
Now, one thing that does loom out there, depending on how long this goes on, is the how much this effect this will have. But we're not able to do as much project development, working to get new projects. That's much harder, and it's complicated by the fact that clients are pulling back and not. They're uncertain about what's coming, so they don't want to be thinking about new projects at this time. So we're doing just fine as a firm right now, but the question is, what's it going to be like next year when we haven't gotten the projects now that are going to be the projects we're doing next year? So that's a big question still.
Can you talk about your experience from 2009 economic downturn, how you, your peers, and the architecture community around you were affected and how you tackled it?
Yeah, 2008, 2009 was really, actually, we were very fortunate as a firm. We actually grew through that recession. So there are a number of factors as to why. We're both an architecture and an engineering firm, and so and when I say engineering, we do heavy infrastructure on the civil side, so horizontal construction as well as vertical construction. And so we do everything from wastewater treatment plants to schools to churches and colleges and airport runways. We do the whole gamut of disciplines. And I think that diversifies us some. So that makes us a little bit more able to ride out the downturn in the economy. So we were very fortunate in that we weren't impacted directly at that time. A lot of my peers, a lot of the firms that I know were devastated during that time. We lost, as you probably know, a whole cohort of architects that left the profession at that time. There just wasn't jobs. And so we're still suffering from the effects of that 11 years later. You can't find those 10 years plus or minus professionals experience. But I think in addition to the structural reasons why we may not have suffered as much, I think we've always been highly attuned to the metrics of our business as a firm, hyper aware of our financials. We had strong cash on hand. We had a strong backlog of work. Looking at the forecast of future work, looking at staffing levels, all of that stuff we do very well. So that helped us ride out that storm. Now, what's interesting, that downturn didn't affect us directly at the time, but a year later, we had a really hard time. So we ended up having to lay some people off a year after the recession. So when I make that point earlier about this crisis, you can hear echoes of what we experienced in 2008 and 2009. And I think we weren't as tuned in to keeping the pipeline full. It's hard to say that it was exactly directly related to the recession, but it seems like we experienced the recession about a year and a half after everybody else in our firm.
I will hand over to Akshay to ask about the advice to architecture students section.
Thank you, Mayur. Mr. Dan, a lot of us are going to be graduating in a month's time, and as you may know of the situation, a lot of jobs have been frozen, and then a lot of positions have been cancelled. So I'm kind of coming back to the question of you having multiple degrees, which kind of helped you become creative in how you approach the field. So on a similar note, how can the graduating students right now approach the field more creatively, and what advice do you have for them?
Yeah. I was talking about running earlier. I was out for a run. That's one of the opportunities that I have to get outside. Early morning runs. Nobody else, the fewer other people are out. And so it's a good time to clear my head and get out. And so this was Wednesday this happened this week. I was out on my run, and my daily route takes me through a park. And so I was running on this sidewalk that's about 6 feet wide. And I was behind a man who was walking the same direction I was running, but I was behind him. And so as I got closer to him and past him, he was on one side of the sidewalk, and there was a tree kind of keeping me on the sidewalk on my side of the sidewalk. And so, for about 3 seconds, I was within 4.5 feet of him. I wasn't 6 feet separated from him. And he turned to me and he said, 6 feet, 6 feet. And I was offended, because I'm very careful about keeping separation from people and being conscious of not infecting other people. I don't have the virus, I don't think, but it just really hit me. I thought, no, I'm one of the enlightened ones. You don't have to scold me. I don't need to know about 6 feet separation. So I was thinking about that the whole whole time and thinking, no, that was a good wake up call. I need to be more careful. I need to give people more room. And so I was returning. I was coming back. My house, my neighborhood is up on a hill. And so the last part of my run is up a really steep hill. And so the end of my run is pretty excruciating. It's hard to get up that hill. And as I was coming back, over my left shoulder, there was a person on a bicycle. And he was standing up, trying to get up the hill himself. And he looked over at me and he smiled and he said, "We can do this. We can do it." And I just loved it. And I thought later, that's a really perfect metaphor for what we're going through. I think, and I think this is true for students as well, and what you're facing in the uncertainty here. This is a really difficult time, and we need to face the brutal facts. We need to be aware of how hard things are. And I need to be reminded to stay 6 feet away from people, even if I think I'm enlightened. We need to be not lose sight of really what's happening. And so I think for students, you need to be tuned in to what's happening in the world, what's happening in the profession. Stay tuned into the news that's coming out about legislation that's being passed, what's affecting firms, what's affecting the rate at which the country is going to be coming back online and opening back up. But at the same time, the second guy on my run was saying, "We're going to make it. We're going to get through this," And I think that's the two things we got to hold in tension, all of us, students included. This is not going to go on forever. We will endure. We've endured harder things as a society. We can do this, but we can't be blissful about that. We have to face the hard, cold facts. So I think that's an interesting framing, way to think about it. So given that, what would I do? Practical advice. If I was a student right now, one thing I would do is join AIA. You can join, even as a student, you can join AIA, and as soon as you graduate, it starts your membership, and it's 18 months of free membership. So if you're a May grad, you can be a member up and through December of 2021 for free. So what does that do? Well, it gives you a magazine where you can keep abreast of what's going on in the profession. It gives you a connection to a local chapter that's got all kinds of programming and other members, firm owners and people in firms that is going to build your network. You're going to get advocacy updates. You're going to see what's going on with legislation around our profession, what's next for our profession, how this is all affecting our profession. You're going to get resources to prep for the tests, the ARE. You're going to get, I think the most important thing is you're going to get a network. And there's a job posting service that's a part of AIA as well. And so I think navigating the uncertainty of what we're facing, I think that would be the basic advice I would give people is to find a network, and a great way to do that is to join AIA.
So this is something independent of, I guess, the current situation. I've often felt that we, as architects, can always try reaching out to more people outside of the architecture community, just to better understand what's happening in the world. What have been some strategies that either your firm or you personally have adopted to reach out to the community and to the larger network?
Yeah, and so I think a place to start with that in terms of creating and developing a network is to think about what your unique perspective is, what your interests are, and then find your people. Find the people that have those same interests, or that have interests that would benefit from your interests and perspectives. That, maybe your interests and perspectives are complementary in some way. And so we relate to people that we resonate with their interest. And I think that's a natural place to start. when we talk about in our firm building community, which is one way we talk about creating a strong network within our firm. And we mean it literally and figuratively. So literally, we build community. We make infrastructure that makes community possible, makes people coming together possible, from, as I said earlier, from wastewater treatment plants to water distribution to roads and runways to banks and churches and schools and colleges. So that's the obvious way we build community, but we also mean it figuratively, meaning we build community by drawing people together. And we mean that both inside the firm and outside the firm. And so I think that might be a helpful way to think about developing a network for students as well, thinking about what your unique contributions are, your interest, your design interest, your expertise, learning the language of, let's say you had an interest in school design. What language are the educators using? What's on their minds? What's the conversation right now? Learning about that is going to be really helpful. And as you're developing that knowledge, you're going to see names that are associated with that area of interest that might become natural places to reach out. And again, if you're connected to a local chapter of AIA, often they're going to have affinity groups within AIA that have interest in various areas. So I think that's a natural place, and that's where I would start. Also, looking for people that have something in common with you, like people that are alumni of the school that you went to. Where are they in the world? Where are they in organizations and firms? And they're going to be glad to hear from you. Now, it doesn't mean they've got a job for you, but they're going to be really honored that somebody reached out to them to just ask a question like you all are doing with me today. I'm honored that you're asking to hear from me today, So asking people for advice, I think, is always a good way to start to build a network. People love to give advice, and so you can learn something. Obviously, they've got something to say that will be useful to you. And as you're learning it, you're making a connection, you're developing a relationship. And I think that's the fundamental, that's what's fundamental to creating a network, a meaningful one. The other thing is try to find ways that you can be useful. If you're going to somebody with something to offer, hey, I think I saw that you wrote this article on X, and I saw this article that has something to do with that. I wonder if this has a connection to what you're thinking about. And they may not have made that connection before. So bringing something of value to that relationship is always a helpful way. Trying to help somebody else advance in what they're doing you'll make friends for life doing that.
I think that's really insightful. We've often heard people talking about being an ideal T-shaped person, where there's a balance of a speciality and someone who's a generalist. So given the scenario right now, what would be a good, instead of saying what would be a good strategy, what would be a good perspective to adopt in terms of talking to people about, in either cases?
Yeah, so this goes back, I think, to me, to where we started this conversation in terms of life seems like a random collision of events when you're experiencing it, and when you look back, maybe you can see how it fits together more clearly. Yeah. I think one of the things in that question, in terms of T-shaped personalities and generalist versus particularist or specialist, is not being too consumed with the details as they're playing out in life. So I'm a big believer in feeding your intuition about what you want to do, what you want to accomplish, where you want to go in life. Know what you're about, know where you want to go, and then what that does is it fuels your intuition to make good choices when they present themselves. So opportunities come along, and they're not always obvious that they're going to get me to that next point that I want to go. But you have sort of an intuition. I think there may be something here. If I volunteer and be on that committee in my chapter of AIA, then I might meet somebody that is going to have something to help me figure out what I'm trying to figure out. But it's not always clear. And so I think we've got to inform our intuition as best we can, and then make choices as we go. But I think there's a sort of a paradoxical thing about generalist and specialist. There are two things that are true that don't seem like they could both be true. But I believe the best specialists are generalists, and vice versa. So pursuing the particular informs your understanding of the universal. So I think, just as a grand example, I think I see life through the lens of being an architect. I understand this world as an architect, which is a pretty thin slice of what it means to exist in the world. But because I have drilled deep in my interest in architecture, I think I understand the broader world better than I would have. Yeah. So it's a particular focus that gives me a broad understanding. And I think it's the tension between specialist and generalist that we have to hold. In a practical way that plays out right now, let's say you're a student and you're thinking about your first job. What's going to happen? What do I need to do? Well, who's hiring right now? A lot of firms have, as you mentioned earlier, have put jobs on hold, and they've frozen hiring. They may even be laying people off, and it looks pretty grim right now. Well, we're having a public health crisis. So the firms that do healthcare are really busy. A lot of them are really busy right now. They're trying to help hospitals accommodate the need. Well, maybe your interest is not healthcare. Maybe you never had an interest to be a healthcare architect, but that happens to be where some work is right now. So maybe you pursue, this is a good example of, I don't know how this is going to feed into where I want to get in life, but I think there might be something here. Well, that might be the job that presents to you, and you get a position to help hospital facilities deal with surge capacity for future pandemics, just as an example. Well, that's not what you set out to do with your life, but you take that job and you do that job for a year or two, and you start to learn how to speak the language of your client. That's a universal skill. You start to connect your work to the bigger societal challenges. That's a universal skill. You start to understand how great design can improve health and wellness. That's not just a healthcare architecture thing. That applies broadly to anything you want to do in architecture. So the particulars of that situation inform the broader window of understanding that you have. And so I think the opportunities for students right now, unfortunately, are more limited than they have been. We came into this crisis with a really robust economy, and that's not the same. But it's showing signs that we're coming out of it, and so I think there's hope, and I think there's opportunity if you're looking for it.
I feel like it's a really great advice, because right now I have seen some friends of mine who are applying to every company. Maybe it's important that we analyze, okay, which industry or which particular jobs have more demand, and focus our efforts in those areas more, rather than have a general approach.
And I think you can be smart about, this also applies to where you want to be, not just what kind of firm you want to work for, but what part of the country or part of the world you want to be. Some parts of the world are hot spots right now. Maybe hard there. People aren't thinking about hiring right now. On the other hand, they may have peaked in terms of infection. They may be coming out of it sooner than other parts that haven't seen it yet. So there's some things to think about in terms of what the opportunities are, but there are opportunities if you're looking for them. And I would encourage students that are watching this to be bold and reach out to firms, reach out to the hiring directors. You know, they're not seeing a lot of activity right now. And so I think people that are reaching out right now are going to stand out in their minds. So it's a time to maybe form a relationship with the firm that you really want to get on. They may not be hiring now, but you know, you can still talk to them. They'll still talk to you, even if they're not hiring. And you know, it's about thinking and seeking opportunity. It may not be obvious, but I think if you're determined and if you're smart about it, I think you'll be memorable.
So in your exhaustive experience in the field, and especially as a member of AI, what qualities have you seen in a person that have served them well in aversing risk and doing well in their career?
Yeah. I think the overriding characteristic that successful people share is grit, determination, perseverance, the ability to stay with it. I happen to believe that passion is overrated, curiosity is underrated. So I think we push each other to say, what's your passion? What are you passionate about? And do you know what your passion is? Well, I think a lot of us don't know what our passion is, but we do have, well, I wonder about that thing. We have curiosity often. And the ability to chase those little rabbits, you know, I wonder what that's about. If you're disciplined about doing that, you start to understand what your passion are. You start to see how these curiosities might fit together into a passion. But to me, the overriding thing is staying with it and really following those curiosities, really drilling into that. Of course, talent is important. A creative talent is something that some people possess and others don't. But again, I think it's overrated. I think if you have determination and grit, you can develop whatever talent you have into something even more useful and effective and beautiful. So I really think it comes down to perseverance. The people that are able to, and it goes back to that run I was telling you about, you know, to be aware of the hard, brutal facts, but to not be so consumed and obsessed with that it gets you down and it paralyzes you and you don't do anything. To also say, we can do this. We're going to get through it. It won't last forever. I think the people that can hold those two things in and persevere. There's a quote that I love from Winston Churchill. And I'm paraphrasing. I'm not going to get it exactly, but it's something like, failure is not final. No, sorry. Failure is not fatal. Success is not final. It's the courage to continue that counts. So I love that because I think I know failure is not fatal. I think that's pretty clear to me in life, and it probably is for you as well. I think we know we can get through failure. But the surprising thing about that quote to me is that just because you have a little bit of success, don't think you're through either. Success is not final. Tomorrow's coming. Whether you've been successful today or failed today, tomorrow's coming. And it's the courage to continue that counts. And I really believe that. I think it's those that persevere and can hold this tension between knowing that it's going to be okay and yet aware of what's going on, that really succeed.
Our viewers can follow you.
I tweet, but very infrequently, at Hart, Hartctect, CHITECT. And best way to get a hold of me, if somebody wanted to talk further, is just my email address. I'd be glad to correspond. So that's dhart@team-psc.com. And I think that's on our website. I think you can contact me through the website.